The dust that clung to Grace Ridley's worn calico dress had become as much a part of her as the hollow ache in her belly. And when the floorboards of Murphy's General Store rushed up to meet her face that sweltering afternoon in July 1878, she didn't even have the strength left to put her hands out to break the fall. The last thing she remembered before darkness claimed her was the startled cry of Mrs. Murphy and the sound of boots thundering across wooden planks. Then there was nothing but the merciful black that swallowed her whole, taking with it the gnawing pain that had been her constant companion for the past 4 days. When consciousness crept back in, Grace found herself cradled against something warm and solid that smelled of leather, horse, and sun-baked plains. Her eyelids felt like they weighed 100 pounds each, but she forced them open to find herself staring up into the most striking pair of gray eyes she had ever seen. They belonged to a man whose face was all hard angles and sun-bronzed skin, with dark hair that fell across his forehead beneath a dusty black hat. "Easy now," he said, his voice a low rumble that seemed to vibrate through her. "You are safe. When did you last eat?" Grace tried to speak, but her throat was so dry that only a rasp came out. The man, who she could now see was young, perhaps in his mid-20s, turned his head and called out, "Mrs. Murphy, water and bread, quickly." "I do not have any money," Grace managed to whisper, shame burning through her chest. She tried to pull away from him to stand on her own, but her limbs refused to cooperate. "Did I ask you for money?" The cowboy's tone was gentle despite the bluntness of his words. "Stay still before you hurt yourself." Mrs. Murphy appeared with a tin cup of water and a thick slice of bread slathered with butter. The cowboy, still holding Grace with one arm, took the cup and brought it to her lips. "Slow sips," he instructed. "Not too fast or you will be sick." The water was the most glorious thing Grace had ever tasted. It took every ounce of her willpower not to gulp it down, but she obeyed his instructions, taking small sips while his steady hand supported the back of her head. When the cup was empty, he set it aside and broke off a small piece of bread. "Same thing here. Small bites, chew slowly." Grace accepted the bread with trembling fingers, but before she could bring it to her mouth, her hand shook so badly that the piece fell to the floor. Tears of frustration and humiliation burned her eyes. "None of that," the cowboy said firmly. He picked up the fallen piece, tossed it aside, and broke off another from the slice Mrs. Murphy still held. This time he brought it to Grace's lips himself. "Open." There was something in his voice, something commanding yet kind, that made Grace obey without thought. The bread touched her tongue, and she had to suppress a moan of pure relief. It was fresh and soft, and the butter melted across her taste buds like liquid gold. She chewed slowly, just as he had instructed, and swallowed. The cowboy waited a moment, watching her carefully, before offering another small piece. They continued this way until the entire slice was gone. Grace could feel strength beginning to seep back into her limbs, though she was still weak as a newborn kitten. The cowboy seemed in no hurry to set her down, and truthfully, Grace was not sure she could stand even if she wanted to. "What is your name?" he asked. "Grace Ridley." "I am Kane Brennan." "How long since you have eaten, Grace?" The way he said her name, with that slight drawl that marked him as a man of these parts, sent an unexpected shiver down her spine. "4 days," she admitted quietly. "Maybe 5, I lost track." Something dangerous flashed in those gray eyes. "4 days," he repeated, his jaw tightening. "Where are your people?" "Dead." The word came out flat, empty of emotion, because Grace had cried all her tears weeks ago. "My father and brother were killed by outlaws on the trail from Missouri. My mother died of fever 2 years back. I am alone." Kane's arms tightened around her almost imperceptibly. "Not anymore," he said, and there was a note of finality in his voice that Grace did not quite understand. "Can you stand?" "I think so." He rose to his feet with her still in his arms, then slowly, carefully, set her down while keeping one hand at her elbow to steady her. Grace's legs wobbled like a newborn colt's, but they held. She was acutely aware of how close Kane stood, how his hand remained at her elbow, warm and solid and reassuring. "Mrs. Murphy," Kane said, turning to the shopkeeper's wife, "put together a basket of supplies. Bread, dried beef, beans, coffee, flour, eggs, whatever you think a person needs for a week. Add it to my account." "Kane, I cannot accept charity," Grace protested, even as her stomach cramped at the thought of food, real food, enough to last more than a single meal. "It is not charity. Consider it a loan if you must." Kane looked down at her, and Grace was struck by how tall he was. She barely came up to his shoulder. "But you will not go hungry again. That is not up for debate." There was steel in his voice, but also something else. Something that made Grace's heart flutter in a way that had nothing to do with her weakened state. She wanted to argue, wanted to maintain some shred of her pride, but the truth was that she had no choice. Without help, she would be dead within the week. "Thank you," she whispered instead. Kane nodded once, then turned back to Mrs. Murphy. "Is there a room she can rent? Somewhere safe?" Mrs. Murphy's round face creased with sympathy. "The boarding house 2 streets over has rooms, but Martha charges $2 a week." "I will take care of it." "Kane, please." Grace tried again, but he cut her off with a look. "We will discuss it later. Right now you need rest and more food." He glanced at Mrs. Murphy. "Can you spare some stew if you have any? I've got a pot on the stove in the back. Let me fetch a bowl." While Mrs. Murphy bustled off, Kane guided Grace to a chair near the front counter. The moment she sat down, exhaustion crashed over her like a wave. She had been running on nothing but desperation and fear for so long that now, with help at hand, her body seemed determined to shut down completely. "Stay awake a little longer," Kane said, crouching down in front of her so they were at eye level. "Once you have eaten some stew, I will take you to the boarding house and you can sleep as long as you need." "Why are you doing this?" Grace asked. "You do not even know me." Kane was quiet for a moment, his gray eyes searching her face with an intensity that made her breath catch. "Because someone should have helped you days ago," he finally said. "Because letting a woman starve when I have the means to prevent it would make me less than a man, and because—" He paused, seeming to struggle with his words. "Because when I saw you fall, something in my chest twisted up so tight I could barely breathe. I do not have a better explanation than that." Grace stared at him, unable to form words. There was such raw honesty in his face, such genuine concern that it made her throat tight with emotion. She had been alone for so long, had faced so much cruelty and indifference in the weeks since her father and brother died, that this sudden kindness from a stranger felt almost overwhelming. Mrs. Murphy returned with a steaming bowl of beef stew and a spoon. The aroma that rose from it made Grace's stomach clench with desperate hunger. Kane took the bowl and, just as he had with the bread, began to feed her himself, small spoonfuls at a time. Grace wanted to protest that she could manage on her own, but the truth was that her hands were still shaking, and there was something oddly comforting about letting him care for her this way. The stew was thick with chunks of beef, potatoes, and carrots, seasoned with herbs that made each bite taste like heaven. Kane fed her patiently, never rushing, watching her face for any sign of distress. About halfway through the bowl, Grace felt her stomach beginning to rebel against the sudden influx of food after so many days of emptiness. "I cannot eat any more," she said quietly. Kane nodded and set the bowl aside without complaint. "You did well." Your stomach will adjust in a day or two, and then you will be able to eat normally again." He stood and offered her his hand. "Come on, let us get you settled at the boarding house." Grace took his hand and let him pull her to her feet. Mrs. Murphy had already packed a large basket full of supplies, which Kane hooked over one arm while keeping his other hand at Grace's back to steady her. The walk to the boarding house was slow, with Grace having to stop twice to catch her breath, but Kane never showed any impatience. He simply waited, his presence a solid, reassuring anchor in a world that had been spinning out of control for far too long. The boarding house was a two-story building with white-painted siding that had seen better days. A sign out front proclaimed it to be Martha's rooms in faded black letters. Kane pushed open the front door and guided Grace inside, where they found a severe-looking woman with iron-gray hair sitting behind a desk. "I need a room for Miss Ridley," Kane said without preamble. "Your best one, for at least a month." Martha's sharp eyes took in Grace's disheveled appearance and pale face, then moved to Kane. "That will be $8. Grace gasped at the sum. $8 was more money than she had seen in months, but Kane was already pulling bills from his pocket and laying them on the desk. "And I will be paying for her meals as well, 3 a day, substantial portions. That is another $6 for the month." Kane laid down more money without hesitation. Martha scooped up the bills, produced a key from a drawer, and stood. "Follow me." The room was on the second floor at the end of the hall. It was small but clean, with a narrow bed covered in a faded quilt, a washstand with a chipped basin and pitcher, a single chair, and a small table beneath the window. To Grace, who had been sleeping in an abandoned shed for the past week, it looked like a palace. "Breakfast is at 7, lunch at noon, supper at 6, Martha said crisply. "You miss a meal, that is your concern, not mine. No gentlemen callers allowed in the rooms. You want to entertain, you do it in the parlor downstairs where I can keep an eye on things." She shot Kane a pointed look as she said this, and he had the grace to look slightly amused. "Understood," Grace said softly. Martha nodded once and left, closing the door behind her. Alone with Kane in the small room, Grace suddenly felt acutely aware of how improper this situation was. An unmarried woman and a man, alone in a bedroom, would set tongues wagging in any respectable town. Kane seemed to sense her discomfort because he moved to the door, setting the basket of supplies on the table as he passed. "I will let you rest," he said, "but I will be back tomorrow to check on you." "Kane." Grace's voice stopped him with his hand on the doorknob. "I will pay you back. Every penny. I do not know how yet, but I will find a way." He turned to look at her, and there was something in his expression that made her heart skip. "I am not worried about the money, Grace. I am worried about you." He paused, then added, "Get some sleep. You are safe now." Then he was gone, the door clicking softly shut behind him, leaving Grace alone in the quiet room. She stood there for a long moment, trying to process everything that had happened in the past hour. She had woken up that morning with no hope, no prospects, and no food, prepared to either beg or steal just to survive another day. Now she had a roof over her head, a bed to sleep in, food in her belly, and a basket full of supplies, all because a cowboy with gray eyes had caught her when she fell. Grace moved to the bed and sat down carefully, her body aching with exhaustion. She knew she should wash up, should try to make herself presentable, but the softness of the mattress beneath her was too inviting to resist. She lay down, still fully clothed, and pulled the quilt up to her chin. Within moments she was asleep. When Grace woke, the light coming through the window was the deep gold of late afternoon. For a moment she was disoriented, unsure of where she was, but then memory came flooding back. The general store. Fainting. Kane. She sat up slowly, relieved to find that while she was still weak, The terrible hollow ache in her belly had subsided to a manageable discomfort. Her head was clearer too, no longer fuzzy with the fog of starvation. Grace stood and moved to the washstand, where she found that someone, probably Martha, had filled the pitcher with fresh water. She poured some into the basin and used the cloth hanging nearby to wash her face and hands. The water was cool and refreshing, and by the time she was done, she felt almost human again. A knock on the door made her jump. "Miss Ridley, it is almost supper time," came Martha's voice from the hallway. "I will be right down," Grace called back. She did her best to smooth down her hair and shake the dust from her dress, but there was only so much that could be done. The dress had once been a pretty blue calico, but months of hard travel and rough living had faded and stained it beyond repair. It was also the only dress she owned. Everything else had been in the wagon when the outlaws attacked, and she had been lucky to escape with her life and the clothes on her back. Grace made her way downstairs, following the sound of voices to a dining room where several other boarders were already seated at a long table. Martha directed her to an empty chair, and within moments, platters of fried chicken, mashed potatoes, green beans, and fresh bread were being passed around. Grace forced herself to take small portions, mindful of how her stomach had reacted earlier, but even the small amount on her plate seemed like a feast. She ate slowly, listening to the chatter around her without really participating. The other boarders were a mix of people, a pair of school teachers, an elderly man who worked as a clerk at the bank, a young couple who were saving money to buy land outside of town. They were all polite but curious about the newcomer, though Grace offered little information beyond her name and that she was new to Tulsa. After supper, Grace returned to her room and finally unpacked the basket Kane had bought for her. There was so much food: bread, dried beef, a sack of beans, another of flour, coffee, even a jar of preserves and a small sack of peppermint candies. At the bottom of the basket, she found a folded piece of paper. She opened it to find a note written in a bold, masculine hand. "Grace, if you need anything, I work at the Brennan Ranch 3 miles west of town. Anyone can give you directions. Kane." Grace read the note 3 times, her fingers tracing over the letters of her name. She carefully folded it and tucked it into the pocket of her dress, then set about storing the food supplies in the small cupboard beside the washstand. As she worked, she found herself thinking about Kane, about the way he had held her so gently, the concern in his eyes, the firmness in his voice when he had declared that she would not go hungry again. She barely knew him, had spent perhaps an hour in his presence, but already he had done more for her than anyone had in months. The question was why. He had said that something in his chest had twisted when he saw her fall, and Grace found herself wondering what he had meant by that. Had it been simple compassion? Or something more? Grace shook her head at her own foolishness. She was being ridiculous, weaving romantic fantasies about a man who had simply been kind to someone in need. He probably helped people all the time. There was nothing special about her, nothing that would make a man like Kane Brennan look at her twice under normal circumstances. Still, as she climbed into bed that night, her stomach full for the first time in days and her body clean from a proper wash, Grace could not stop thinking about gray eyes and strong arms and the feeling of being safe. The next morning, Grace woke to sunlight streaming through the window and the sound of activity from the street below. She felt better than she had in weeks, the rest and food having worked wonders on her body. She washed and dressed, doing her best to make herself presentable despite her worn clothing, then made her way downstairs for breakfast. Martha served up plates of eggs, bacon, and toast, along with strong coffee that helped clear the last of the cobwebs from Grace's mind. She was just finishing her second cup when Martha appeared at her elbow. "You have a visitor. The Brennan boy is waiting in the parlor." Grace's heart gave an unexpected lurch. She set down her coffee cup and smoothed her hands over her dress nervously before making her way to the parlor. Kane was standing by the window, hat in his hands, looking out at the street. He had cleaned up since yesterday, his dark hair still damp and his shirt free of trail dust. When he heard her enter, he turned, and Grace saw relief flash across his face. "You look better," he said. "I feel better." "Thanks to you." Grace twisted her hands together, suddenly shy. "I did not expect to see you so soon. I said I would check on you." Kane moved closer, his eyes scanning her face with an intensity that made her feel warm all over. "Did you sleep well? Have you eaten?" "Yes to both." "Martha feeds her boarders well." "Good." Kane was quiet for a moment, seeming to struggle with something. Finally, he said, "I have been thinking. You said you need to find a way to pay me back." Grace straightened her shoulders. "I meant it. I will not be a charity case." "I believe you." "So I have a proposal." Kane paused. "The Brennan Ranch belongs to my father and uncle. It is a good-sized operation, cattle and horses, but we are always short on help in the house. My mother passed away 3 years ago, and my aunt is getting on in years. She manages the cooking and cleaning, but it is getting to be too much for her. We could use someone to help with the household work. The job comes with room and board plus wages of $10 a month. It would give you a way to earn money and pay me back, if you are still set on that." Grace stared at him. "You are offering me a job if you want it. I will not pretend it is easy work. Running a ranch household takes effort, but you would have a roof over your head, 3 meals a day, and wages in your pocket." And he paused, his eyes meeting hers. "You would be safe. My father and uncle run a respectable operation. No one would bother you there." It was perfect, too perfect. Grace felt suspicion stir. "Why would you do this for me? You do not know anything about me. I could be a thief or a liar." "Are you?" "No, but you have no way of knowing that." Kane took another step closer, close enough that Grace had to tilt her head back to maintain eye contact. "I am a good judge of character, Grace. I can see in your eyes that you are honest. I saw it yesterday when you tried to refuse my help, even though you were half dead from hunger. A thief or a con artist would have taken what was offered without a second thought." He paused. "And to be honest, I want you where I can see you, where I know you are eating properly and not sleeping in some shed or alley." "How did you know about the shed?" Grace asked, startled. "I asked around yesterday after I left you. Found out you have been in town about a week, sleeping rough, trying to find work. Mrs. Carson at the dress shop said you came in asking for a job, and she turned you away because you looked too ragged." There was anger in Kane's voice now. "Half a dozen people saw you struggling and did nothing to help." Grace did not know what to say. The fact that he had cared enough to investigate to find out about her situation made something warm unfurl in her chest. "So this job offer is real. You are not just making it up to help me." "The job is real. Aunt Caroline will be thrilled to have the help, but yes, I am offering it to you specifically because I want to help you. Is that so wrong?" "No," Grace said softly. "No, it is not wrong. It is just, I am not used to people being kind without wanting something in return." Kane's expression softened. "I do not want anything from you except the chance to make sure you are taken care of. Will you accept the job?" Grace thought about her options, which were essentially non-existent. She could refuse out of pride and go back to barely surviving, or she could accept his offer and have a real chance at building a life for herself. When she thought of it that way, the choice was obvious. "Yes," she said. "I accept. When do I start?" "Today, if you are feeling up to it. I have a wagon outside. We can collect your things and head out to the ranch." "I do not have any things," Grace admitted. "Just what is in the basket you bought me yesterday." Kane's jaw tightened, but all he said was, "Then we will stop by the general store and get you some proper supplies first. You will need work dresses and a few other necessities. Kane, I cannot ask you to spend more money on me. You are not asking. I am offering. Consider it an advance on your wages." Before she could protest further, he added, "Grace, you cannot work in a ranch house with only one dress to your name. Be practical." He had a point, much as it galled her to admit it. Grace nodded slowly. "An advance, then. I will pay it back. I know you will." Kane moved toward the door, then paused and looked back at her. "One more thing. At the ranch, there are rules. My father and uncle are good men, but they run a working operation with hired hands coming and going. They know to be respectful, but if anyone bothers you or makes you uncomfortable, you tell me immediately. Understood?" There was something protective in his tone, something possessive almost, that made Grace's pulse quicken. Understood. They collected the basket from Grace's room and settled her account with Martha, who seemed unsurprised by this turn of events. "The Brennan Ranch is a good place," she told Grace. "Caroline Brennan is a fair woman. You will be well treated there." Kane's wagon was a sturdy affair pulled by 2 horses, and he helped Grace up onto the bench seat with a hand at her elbow before climbing up beside her. The drive to the general store was short, and once there, Kane proved to be surprisingly knowledgeable about what Grace would need. He directed Mrs. Murphy to pull together 3 practical work dresses, undergarments, a warm shawl, sturdy boots, a hairbrush, soap, and various other necessities. When Grace saw the total, she felt faint all over again, but Kane paid without blinking. "This is too much," Grace whispered as they loaded the packages into the wagon. "This is what you need to do the job properly," Kane corrected. "Stop worrying about the money. You will work it off soon enough if you are that determined." With the supplies loaded, Kane drove the wagon west out of Tulsa. The landscape was classic Oklahoma territory, rolling prairie dotted with scrub brush and the occasional stand of trees. The July heat was oppressive, but there was a faint breeze that made it bearable. Kane kept the horses at an easy pace, and Grace found herself relaxing slightly as the town fell away behind them. "Tell me about your family," Kane said after a while, "if you do not mind talking about it." Grace was quiet for a moment, then decided that if she was going to be living at his family's ranch, he deserved to know her story. "My father was a farmer in Missouri. We had a good life, or at least I thought we did. But he got it into his head that there was better land to be had in the Oklahoma territory. He sold our farm and convinced my brother to come with us. My mother had already passed by then, so it was just the 3 of us and a wagon full of our belongings." She paused, swallowing against the tightness in her throat. "We were 2 days out from Tulsa when the outlaws found us. There were 4 of them. They wanted the wagon, the horses, everything. My father and brother tried to fight them off." Her voice dropped to barely a whisper. "They killed them both, shot them down like dogs." Kane's hands tightened on the reins, but he said nothing, letting her continue at her own pace. "They would have killed me too, or worse, but one of their horses spooked and bolted. In the confusion, I ran. I hid in a ravine for hours, until I was sure they were gone. When I came back, the wagon was stripped clean and my father and brother were dead. I buried them as best I could with my bare hands and a piece of board from the wagon. Then I walked to Tulsa." "I am sorry," Kane said quietly. "That should not have happened to you. It happened, though. And now here I am, alive when they are dead, trying to figure out how to keep going." Kane was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice was firm. "You keep going by living, by taking the job at the ranch and building a new life. By letting people help you when you need it, and not carrying all the weight by yourself. That is how you honor your father and brother, by surviving and making something of yourself. Grace looked at him, this cowboy who barely knew her but seemed to understand her pain in a way no one else had. "Is that what you did? When your mother died?" "Yes. It nearly broke my father losing her. She was everything to him. But he kept going because he had to, because the ranch needed him and I needed him. And eventually, the pain got easier to bear." Kane glanced at her. "It does not go away, the grief, but it stops being the only thing you feel." They rode in companionable silence for a while after that, each lost in their own thoughts. Eventually, Kane pointed to a cluster of buildings in the distance. "There, that is the Brennan Ranch." As they drew closer, Grace could see that the ranch was indeed a substantial operation. The main house was a sprawling single-story structure built of wood and stone, with a wide porch that wrapped around the front and side. Behind it were a large barn, several outbuildings, a bunkhouse for the hired hands, and a network of corrals holding horses and cattle. Everything looked well-maintained, prosperous even, and Grace felt a flutter of nervousness in her stomach. Kane drove the wagon right up to the main house and helped Grace down. Before they could reach the porch, the front door opened and a woman emerged. She was perhaps in her late 50s, with gray-streaked brown hair pulled back in a bun and a face that showed the weathering of years spent under the prairie sun. Her eyes, Grace noted, were the same gray as Kane's. "Kane, you are back. I was beginning to worry." The woman's gaze shifted to Grace, and her expression turned curious. "And you have brought a guest." "Aunt Caroline, this is Grace Ridley. Grace, my Aunt Caroline Brennan." Kane rested a hand lightly on the small of Grace's back, a gesture that did not go unnoticed by his aunt. "I have offered her the position we discussed, the one helping you with the household." Caroline's eyebrows rose slightly, but she smiled warmly at Grace. "Is that so? Well then, welcome to the Brennan Ranch, Miss Ridley. I am pleased to have the help, truly. Running this place alone has been wearing me down more than I like to admit." "Thank you for having me, Mrs. Brennan," Grace said, curtsying slightly out of habit. "None of that. You call me Caroline and I will call you Grace. We do not stand on ceremony here." Caroline looked between Grace and Kane with shrewd eyes that saw far too much. "Why do not you show Grace to the spare room, Kane? I imagine she will want to settle in before supper." Kane picked up the packages from the wagon and led Grace inside. The house was cool and welcoming, with wood floors polished to a shine and windows that let in plenty of light. Kane guided her down a hallway off the main living area and opened a door near the end. "This will be your room. It is not fancy, but it is comfortable." The room was larger than the one at the boarding house, with a real bed frame and mattress, a wardrobe, a chest of drawers, and a rocking chair by the window. There was even a small stove in the corner for heat in the winter months. It was, by far, the nicest room Grace had ever had. "It is perfect," she breathed. Kane set her packages on the bed. "Unpack and rest for a bit. I will come find you before supper and introduce you to my father and uncle." He started to leave, then turned back. "Grace, I am glad you are here." Before she could respond, he was gone, closing the door softly behind him. Grace stood in the middle of the room, her heart pounding, trying to understand the surge of emotion that crashed through her. She barely knew this man, had met him only yesterday, but already he had turned her entire world upside down. He had saved her life, given her hope, and brought her to a place where she might actually have a chance at a future. Grace moved to the window and looked out across the ranch, where she could see Kane walking toward the barn, his long strides confident and sure. As she watched him, she felt something shift inside her, something that had been closed off and frozen since her father and brother died. It was too soon to call it love, too soon to even call it attraction really, but it was the beginning of something. A tiny flame of possibility that, if she was very careful and very lucky, might grow into something real. That evening, Grace met the rest of the Brennan family over supper. Kane's father, Kenneth Brennan, was a tall man in his 50s with the same dark hair as his son, though liberally streaked with gray, and the same gray eyes. His face was weathered from years of outdoor work, but his smile was warm as he shook Grace's hand. "Welcome to the ranch, Miss Ridley. Kane tells me you have had a rough time of it. I hope you will find safety and comfort here." "Thank you, sir. I am grateful for the opportunity." Kane's uncle, James Brennan, was Kenneth's younger brother, perhaps in his late 40s. He had lighter hair and blue eyes, but the same strong build. He was quieter than Kenneth, but equally welcoming. The meal was simple but hearty: beef stew with fresh bread and butter, followed by apple pie that Caroline clearly took pride in. The conversation flowed easily, with the Brennan men discussing ranch business and asking Grace polite questions about her background. She gave them an abbreviated version of her story, and she saw sympathy flash across all their faces. "Those outlaws are a plague," Kenneth said darkly. "Territorial law tries, but there are too many places for them to hide and not enough marshals to hunt them down. I am very sorry for your loss, Miss Ridley." "Thank you, sir." After supper, Caroline showed Grace around the house and explained her duties. The work was indeed substantial, cooking for the family and the hired hands who took their meals at the ranch, cleaning, laundry, mending, and various other tasks. But it was honest work, and Grace threw herself into it with determination. The days developed a rhythm. Grace rose early, helped Caroline prepare breakfast, served the family and the ranch hands, then spent the day working through the endless list of household tasks. The work was hard, much harder than anything she had done back in Missouri, but there was a satisfaction in it. And there was the undeniable fact that she was eating regularly, sleeping in a real bed, and earning wages. Kane was a constant presence, though he was often busy with ranch work during the day. But he made a point of finding Grace at least once each day, checking on her, asking how she was settling in. Sometimes he would help her with tasks that required heavy lifting or reaching high places. Other times, he would simply sit with her on the porch in the evening, talking about nothing and everything while the sun set over the prairie. Grace found herself looking forward to those moments more than she cared to admit. There was something about Kane that drew her, beyond his obvious physical appeal. He was kind without being condescending, strong without being domineering. He listened when she spoke and remembered the things she told him. And there was a way he looked at her sometimes, when he thought she was not paying attention, that made her heart race. Caroline noticed, of course. The older woman was far too observant to miss the way Kane's eyes tracked Grace whenever she was in the room, or the way Grace's cheeks flushed when he spoke to her. About 2 weeks after Grace arrived, Caroline cornered her in the kitchen while they were preparing lunch. "My nephew is smitten with you," Caroline said without preamble. Grace nearly dropped the bowl she was holding. What? Do not pretend you have not noticed. Kane looks at you like you hung the moon." Caroline smiled. "I have not seen him show interest in a woman since Sarah Miller moved to Texas 3 years ago. It is good to see." "He is just being kind," Grace protested weakly. "He helped me when I needed it, that is all. That may be how it started, but it is not all it is now." Caroline paused. "The question is, how do you feel about him?" Grace was quiet for a long moment, then admitted quietly, "I do not know. I am grateful to him, certainly, but I cannot tell if what I feel is genuine affection or just gratitude because he saved me. It would not be fair to him to confuse the two." Caroline nodded approvingly. "That is wise. But here is something to consider." Gratitude fades with time. If what you feel for Kane is still there in a few months after the memory of how desperate you were is dimmed, then you will know it is real. It was good advice, and Grace tried to take it to heart. But as the weeks passed and summer gave way to early autumn, her feelings for Kane did not fade. If anything, they grew stronger. She found herself noticing small things about him: the way his face lit up when he smiled, the gentleness in his hands when he worked with the horses, the patience he showed with everyone around him. She noticed, too, that he was respected by the ranch hands, that his father and uncle valued his opinions, that he worked harder than anyone else despite being the boss's son. And she noticed the way he looked at her, with a warmth in his gray eyes that made her breath catch. The way he found excuses to be near her, to touch her hand when passing her something, to stand close when they talked. The way he always made sure she had enough to eat, sometimes slipping extra portions onto her plate when he thought she was not looking. It was in late September, nearly 3 months after Grace had arrived at the ranch, that things finally came to a head. The Brennan family was preparing for the annual cattle drive to market, a week-long journey that would take most of the men away from the ranch. Kane had been unusually quiet for several days, and Grace could tell something was bothering him. The night before the drive was set to begin, Grace was sitting on the porch in the rocking chair, enjoying the cool evening air after a long day of work. She heard footsteps and looked up to see Kane approaching. He had cleaned up from the day's work, his dark hair still damp, wearing a clean shirt and vest. "Mind if I join you?" he asked. "Of course not." Kane settled himself on the porch railing, facing her. For a long moment he was silent, his eyes studying her face in the fading light. Finally he said, "I need to tell you something before I leave tomorrow." Grace's heart began to pound. "What is it?" "I have been trying to give you time," Kane said slowly. "Time to heal, time to settle in, time to figure out what you want from life. But I am leaving tomorrow for a week, and I cannot go without telling you how I feel." "Kane," Grace began, but he held up a hand. "Please, let me say this. If you do not feel the same way, I will accept it and we will go on as we have been, but I need you to know." He took a deep breath. "From the moment I saw you fall in that general store, something changed in me. I could not stop thinking about you, could not stop worrying about whether you were safe and fed and cared for. And these past 3 months, getting to know you, seeing your strength and your kindness and your courage, I have fallen in love with you, Grace. Completely and utterly in love." Grace felt tears spring to her eyes. She had hoped, had dared to dream, but hearing the words spoken aloud was overwhelming. "I do not expect you to say it back," Kane continued. "I know you have been through hell, and I know you might not be ready for this, but I needed you to know I love you. And if you will have me, I would like to court you properly, with the intention of making you my wife someday." The tears spilled over, running down Grace's cheeks. Kane immediately looked alarmed. "Please do not cry. I did not mean to upset you." "You did not upset me," Grace said, her voice thick with emotion. She stood and moved to where he sat on the railing, close enough that she could reach out and touch him. "Kane, I thought I was imagining it, thought I was being foolish. I did not dare believe that you could feel that way about me." "You are not foolish," Kane said fiercely. He reached up and gently wiped away her tears with his thumb. "You are brilliant and strong and beautiful, and any man would be lucky to earn your affection." "I was trying to be practical," Grace admitted. "Trying to make sure what I felt was real and not just gratitude. But Caroline was right. The gratitude has faded, but what I feel for you has only grown stronger. I love you too, Kane. I think I started falling for you the moment you caught me in that store." Kane's face transformed, joy lighting his features from within. "Say it again." "I love you," Grace repeated, smiling through her tears. Kane stood and pulled her into his arms, holding her close. Grace buried her face against his chest, feeling his heart pounding as hard as her own. They stood like that for a long moment, just holding each other before Kane pulled back slightly and cupped her face in his hands. "May I kiss you?" he asked. "Yes," Grace breathed. Kane lowered his head and pressed his lips to hers, gentle and sweet and full of promise. It was Grace's first kiss, and it was everything she had dreamed of and more. When they finally pulled apart, both were breathless. "I will come back as soon as I can," Kane promised. "And when I do, we will talk about our future. About when we can be married, about what kind of life we want to build together." "Does that sound good?" "That sounds perfect," Grace said. Kane kissed her again, lingering this time before finally forcing himself to step back. "I should go. Early start tomorrow, but Grace, thank you for trusting me, for giving us a chance. You have made me the happiest man alive." Grace watched him walk away, her fingers touching her lips, her heart so full she thought it might burst. For the first time since her father and brother died, she felt genuinely happy. She had found not just safety and security with the Brennans, but love. Real, true love. The week Kane was gone felt like an eternity. Grace threw herself into her work, helping Caroline with the endless tasks of running the ranch household. But at night, lying in her bed, she would think about Kane's confession, about the feel of his arms around her and his lips on hers. And she would smile in the darkness. When the cattle drive finally returned, Grace was helping Caroline prepare supper when she heard the commotion outside. She wiped her hands on her apron and stepped out onto the porch to see the dusty, tired men riding in. Her eyes immediately found Kane, who was dismounting from his horse. He looked up, saw her standing there, and his entire face lit up. He strode across the yard, taking the porch steps 2 at a time, and before Grace quite knew what was happening, he had swept her up in his arms and was spinning her around. She laughed, clinging to his shoulders, not caring that several of the ranch hands were watching with knowing grins. "I missed you," Kane said, setting her down but keeping his arms around her waist. "I missed you too," Grace admitted. "Then let us not waste any more time apart." Kane took her hand. "Come with me. I want to show you something." He led her away from the house, past the barn and corrals, to a spot on a small rise that overlooked the ranch. The sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink and purple. It was beautiful, peaceful, and utterly perfect. "I have been thinking about this all week," Kane said, turning to face her. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small box. "I know we have only known each other a few months. I know some people would say we should wait longer. But Grace, I have never been more certain of anything in my life. I love you, and I want to spend the rest of my days making sure you never feel hungry or scared or alone again." He opened the box to reveal a simple gold band with a small diamond. "This was my mother's ring. My father gave it to me before we left for the drive. Said he would be honored if I gave it to the woman I loved. Grace Ridley, will you marry me?" Grace looked at the ring, then at Kane's face, at the hope and love shining in his eyes. She thought about everything that had brought her to this moment, all the pain and loss and fear, and how it had all led her to this man who had saved her in every way a person could be saved. "Yes," she said, her voice clear and strong. "Yes, Kane, I will marry you." Kane slipped the ring onto her finger, then pulled her into a kiss that was deeper and more passionate than the one they had shared before. When they finally broke apart, both were grinning like fools. "How soon?" Kane asked. "I do not want a long engagement." "Neither do I." "As soon as we can arrange it." "Next month then. October. We will have the ceremony here at the ranch, invite the whole town. I want everyone to know that you are mine and I am yours." Grace laughed. "That sounds wonderful." They stood on that rise watching the sunset, planning their future together, until Caroline's voice called them back for supper. Walking back to the house hand in hand, Grace felt a sense of peace settle over her. She had survived the worst that life could throw at her, and now she was going to marry the man she loved. It was more than she had ever dared hope for. The next month passed in a flurry of preparations. Grace and Caroline worked together to make a wedding dress, altering one of Caroline's old gowns to fit Grace's smaller frame. Kenneth and James made sure the ranch was in perfect order, while Kane seemed to be perpetually smiling, much to the amusement of the ranch hands. The wedding took place on a crisp October afternoon. The ceremony was held outside in front of the ranch house, with a traveling preacher officiating. Grace wore her white dress with wildflowers in her hair, and Kane wore his best suit. The entire town seemed to have turned out, along with all the ranch hands and neighboring ranchers. When the preacher pronounced them husband and wife, Kane kissed Grace with such enthusiasm that the crowd erupted in laughter and applause. The celebration that followed lasted well into the night, with music and dancing and enough food to feed an army. As the party wound down and guests began to depart, Kane led Grace away to the small cabin that had been prepared for them. It was located a short distance from the main house, giving them privacy while keeping them close to family. Kane had spent the past week fixing it up, and it was cozy and perfect. "Welcome home, Mrs. Brennan," Kane said, carrying her over the threshold. Grace laughed, her arms around his neck. "I love the sound of that, Mrs. Brennan." Kane set her down gently, his hands coming up to frame her face. "I love you," he said seriously. "I will spend every day of our lives together making sure you know it." "I love you too," Grace whispered. "Thank you for saving me, for not letting me starve." "I will never let you starve, Grace. Not for food, not for love, not for anything. That is my promise to you." And then he was kissing her, and Grace forgot about everything except the feeling of being in his arms, of being loved and cherished and safe. They made love that night with tenderness and passion, and Grace thought her heart might burst with happiness. The months that followed were the happiest of Grace's life. She and Kane settled into married life with an ease that surprised them both. Kane continued to work the ranch alongside his father and uncle, while Grace managed their home and helped Caroline when needed. The work was hard, but Grace did not mind. She had Kane waiting for her at the end of each day, ready to pull her into his arms and hear about everything that had happened. As winter set in, Grace discovered she was pregnant. She told Kane one evening as they sat by the fire in their cabin, and he let out a whoop of joy that probably woke half the ranch. He immediately became even more protective than before, insisting she rest more and work less, fussing over her constantly. "Kane, I am pregnant, not an invalid," Grace protested with a laugh when he tried to carry her from the main house to their cabin after supper one night. "Humor me," Kane said, pressing a kiss to her temple. "You are carrying my child. Let me take care of you." Grace's son was born in early June of 1879, a healthy baby boy with his father's dark hair and his mother's green eyes. They named him Daniel Kenneth, after no one in particular, but because they both liked the name. Kane was absolutely besotted, spending hours just holding his son and marveling at the tiny hands and feet. "He is perfect," Kane would say over and over, "just like his mother." Grace would laugh and remind him that she was far from perfect, but Kane always insisted otherwise. He was a devoted father, helping with Daniel even when the work exhausted him, never complaining about sleepless nights or endless crying. As Daniel grew from baby to toddler, the ranch continued to prosper. Kenneth and James were pleased with Kane's management skills and gradually gave him more responsibility. Grace continued to help Caroline, though she now had Daniel to care for as well. The two women had become close, more like mother and daughter than employer and employee. When Daniel was 2, Grace found herself pregnant again. This time, she gave birth to a daughter they named Emma Grace. She had her mother's red gold hair and her father's gray eyes, and Kane declared her the most beautiful baby girl in all of Oklahoma. Life settled into a pleasant routine. Kane and Grace's cabin was expanded to accommodate their growing family. Kenneth eventually decided to retire from active ranching, turning over most of the operations to Kane and James. Caroline, now in her 60s, also began to slow down, and Grace found herself running the main house almost entirely on her own, with hired help for the heaviest work. On their 5th wedding anniversary, Kane took Grace back to the rise where he had proposed. They left the children with Caroline and climbed the hill hand in hand, just as they had so many times before. "You remember the first time I brought you here?" Kane asked, pulling Grace against his side as they watched the sunset. "Of course, you asked me to marry you. How could I forget? I was so nervous. I thought you might say no," Grace laughed. "Never, I loved you too much by then." "And now?" Kane looked down at her, his eyes serious. "Do you still love me? Are you happy, Grace?" Grace turned in his arms to face him fully. "Kane, you gave me everything. You saved my life, gave me a home and a family and a purpose. You love me and our children with everything you have. How could I be anything but happy? I just want to make sure. I know it is not an easy life ranching. I know you work hard every day. We all work hard, but we work together and we have built something beautiful here. I would not change a single thing." Grace reached up to cup his face. "Except maybe to go back and tell that scared, starving girl in the general store that everything was going to be all right. That the man who caught her would become her whole world." Kane kissed her then, slow and deep, pouring 5 years of love and devotion into it. When they pulled apart, both were smiling. "Thank you," Kane said quietly. "For what?" "For fainting at exactly the right moment so I could catch you. For being brave enough to accept my help. For falling in love with me. For giving me Daniel and Emma. For everything, Grace." "Thank you for everything." Grace felt tears prick her eyes, the good kind this time. "Thank you for making sure I never starved again. For food, for love, for hope. You saved me, Kane, in every way a person can be saved." They stood on that rise until the stars came out, holding each other and talking about their dreams for the future. They would have more children, they decided, at least one more. They would continue to build the ranch, maybe buy more land. They would grow old together on this prairie, surrounded by family and love, and that is exactly what they did. Over the years, Grace and Kane had 2 more children, another son named Thomas and a daughter named Caroline after Kane's beloved aunt. The ranch prospered under Kane's leadership, eventually becoming one of the most successful operations in Oklahoma. Kenneth passed peacefully in his sleep at age 70, and Caroline followed a few years later, both having lived long enough to see their grandchildren and great-grandchildren thrive. Grace never forgot the pain of losing her father and brother, but the sharp edge of grief dulled over time, just as Kane had promised it would. She made sure to tell her children stories about their grandfather and uncle they had never met, keeping their memory alive. As for the outlaws who had killed them, justice eventually caught up. A few years after Grace and Kane married, a territorial marshal tracked down the gang responsible and brought them in. Kane made sure Grace knew they had been captured and tried, though he spared her the details of their punishment. It gave her a sense of closure, knowing that they had paid for their crimes. The years passed in a blur of seasons, of children growing and the ranch expanding, of quiet evenings by the fire and busy days full of work and laughter. Grace and Kane grew older together, their dark hair turning silver, their faces gaining lines, but their love never wavered. On their 40th wedding anniversary, their children and grandchildren gathered at the ranch for a celebration. Daniel, now a man of 40 with children of his own, gave a toast to his parents. "To my father," he said, raising his glass, "who taught me that real strength is being gentle with those you love. And to my mother, who showed me that courage is not the absence of fear, but moving forward despite it. You two have given us all an example of what true love looks like. May we all be lucky enough to find what you have found in each other." Everyone cheered and drank, and Grace looked at Kane with tears in her eyes. He was 70 now, his hair white, his face deeply lined, but when he smiled at her, she saw the same young cowboy who had caught her when she fell all those years ago. "What are you thinking?" Kane asked softly, taking her hand. "I am thinking about that day in the general store. About how desperate and hopeless I felt, about how I thought my life was over." Grace squeezed his hand. "I am thinking about how wrong I was. My life did not end that day. It began, because you were there to catch me." Kane brought her hand to his lips and kissed it gently. "I will always catch you, Grace. Always." And he did. For the rest of their long lives together, Kane Brennan made good on every promise he had ever made to Grace. He made sure she never went hungry, never felt unloved, never doubted for a moment that she was the most important thing in his world. They built a life together filled with love and laughter, hard work and simple joys, children and grandchildren, and eventually great-grandchildren. When Kane passed away at age 78, surrounded by his family, his last words were for Grace. "Thank you for loving me," he whispered, his hand in hers. "Thank you for letting me take care of you. It has been the greatest honor of my life." Grace, her heart breaking but also full of gratitude for all the years they had shared, kissed his forehead one last time. "And thank you for saving me," she whispered back, "for catching me when I fell and never letting me go." Kane smiled, squeezed her hand once more, and then he was gone. Grace grieved deeply, but she did not despair. She had their children and grandchildren around her, a legacy of love that would continue long after both she and Kane were gone. She had memories of 45 years of marriage, of a love that had sustained her through every trial and blessed her with every joy. Grace lived another 5 years after Kane's death, spending her time with family and helping to raise the newest generation of Brennans. She told them stories about their grandfather, about the kind, strong cowboy who had saved a starving girl in a general store and then spent the rest of his life making sure she never wanted for anything. When Grace's time finally came, she passed peacefully in her sleep, a smile on her face. Her children buried her next to Kane on that rise overlooking the ranch, the place where he had proposed all those years ago. They placed a simple marker that read, "Grace Ridley Brennan, beloved wife, mother, and grandmother. She was loved." But Grace's true legacy was not in the stone marker or even in the children and grandchildren she left behind. It was in the story of how love could find a person even in their darkest moment, how kindness could change the course of a life, and how a single act of compassion could ripple forward through generations. The ranch continued to thrive long after Grace and Kane were gone, run by their descendants who remembered the values their grandparents had instilled: hard work, kindness, family, and love. These were the things that mattered, the things that lasted. And sometimes, on quiet evenings when the sun was setting over the Oklahoma prairie, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink, the Brennan grandchildren would climb that rise and imagine they could see the ghosts of Grace and Kane standing there, young again, hand in hand, looking out over the land they had built together. A cowboy and the woman he had saved, whose love story had become legend in the family. It had all started with a moment of desperate hunger and a stranger's kindness in a dusty general store in Tulsa. But it had grown into something beautiful and lasting, a testament to the power of love to heal and transform. Kane had promised Grace that he would never let her starve again, and he had kept that promise in every way that mattered. He had fed her body with food, her heart with love, her soul with devotion. And in return, Grace had given him a life rich with meaning and purpose, filled with the laughter of children and the comfort of partnership. Together, they had built something that would endure long after they were gone, a legacy of love that would echo through the generations. And in the end, that was everything. That was more than either of them had ever dared dream of on that hot July day in 1878, when a young woman fainted from hunger and a cowboy caught her, changing both their lives forever. Their story became a reminder that sometimes salvation comes in the form of a stranger's helping hand, that love can bloom in the most unlikely circumstances, and that the smallest act of kindness can have the most profound impact. Kane had simply done what any decent man would do. He had helped someone in need. But that simple act had saved Grace's life and, in many ways, had given meaning to his own. The Brennan Ranch stands to this day, still run by descendants of Kane and Grace, still a testament to the love and hard work of the couple who built it. And every July, on the anniversary of the day they met, the family gathers on that rise to remember the cowboy and the woman he saved, to tell the story once more to the newest generation, to make sure that Grace and Kane's love is never forgotten, because some love stories deserve to be remembered. Some love stories show us what is possible when compassion meets courage, when strength is tempered with gentleness, when two people commit to building a life together against all odds. The story of Kane and Grace is one of those stories, a reminder that even in the hardest times in the wild and often unforgiving American West, love could flourish and endure. And it all started with a simple promise: I will never let you starve again. A promise that Kane Brennan kept every single day for the rest of his life, in ways both big and small. It was a promise that changed everything, that saved a life, and created a legacy that would last for generations. That is the power of love. That is the power of keeping your word. That is the story of Grace and Kane, the woman who fainted from hunger and the cowboy who caught her, fed her, loved her, and never, ever let her starve again.